David DeWitt to get us started.
Thanks, Les, very much. And welcome to those who are already on, and I expect we'll be having many more over the next few minutes. And a particular welcome to Mikhael, Rabbi Mikhael Manekin, right now in Jerusalem, where he has his home, originally from Midwest United States. Is that correct? I think.
Baltimore, the most
Well,
Midwest west on the East Coast, I guess.
Midwest. He's okay. Baltimore. We can't hold that against you. So
Uh,
Johns Hopkins is a good place to be.
yeah.
Yes, for sure. So it's really a pleasure to have you join us. Uh, and you graciously said that you're quite comfortable doing a self-introduction. Um, I will let you do that. I will just add, however, um, so that in case we run into some false modesty, I want to say that Mikhail came to me highly recommended by my friend and our colleague Derek Pensler, and Mikhail is the author of an important book titled "End of Days: Ethics, Tradition, and Power in Israel." That came out in as a paperback in 2023. And I will leave it to you to talk about your websites and your other activities. But it's a pleasure. The theme that we agreed on some time ago was civil society and democracy, the intersection of faith, politics, and social justice, which seems to me to be more important than ever. And let me invite you to share your wisdom and knowledge with us.
Sure. Thank you so much for hosting me. I'll say prior to the introduction that I'm in Jerusalem, which is right now, which has been relatively okay, but we do have occasional sirens and need to go to, I think it translates to bomb shelter, but that sounds very dramatic. Um, uh, it is a room next door, but I still might need to go. So if I do, I apologize in advance. Um, what I was thinking of doing, I'll say a bit about myself, a bit about the question at hand from my particular perspective, maybe some other thoughts that roam into my head as we discuss. I'll do that for around a half an hour, and then if there are any questions or comments, I'd be happy to respond. So as was noted, my name is Michael. I'm 47 years old as of midnight tonight,
Oh,
in my Gregorian birthday. I've been very, very fortunate to be an activist for the last couple of decades in various different initiatives. I ran an organization called Breaking the Silence in its first years, which is an organization of veterans. And I ran a think tank afterwards called Molad, a Center for Renewal of Israeli Democracy, which does work thinking in that regard. Over the last 9 years, I've been running a political fellowship program which focuses on the internal Jewish-Arab divide between Jewish citizens of Israel and Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel on the political front, called the Alliance Fellowship Program. And over the last 3 years, which I think will be the focus of our conversation, I've been very fortunate to be involved in the leadership of a new movement in Israel called the Faithful Left, or the Smol Emuni. And I'll talk a bit about that in that regard. Now, I was asked to speak about the situation of democracy right now in various different regards. And it's tempting to speak about the fact that we're right now in a war. And it is important for me to say that I have very little to offer in the regard of talking about Iran or everything happening in the larger Middle East. I think people are quick to give very detailed analysis on everything happening around them, and I want to modestly say that I have no idea what's happening. It's very hard, I think, even as an informed citizen, as an active informed citizen anywhere around the world, to understand strategies and calculations. All I can say is from an emotional perspective, that there's incredible frustration in just the lack of ability to sort of live life as just a regular individual. And I think one of the sad things happening in our society over the last couple of years is the normalcy of being in a situation of war. Um, and it's hard to remember sometimes that the situation is abnormal and that our desires shouldn't be only to survive, whatever that means, but to thrive and to live happy and healthy lives. I don't think that's sort of a high bar to aspire to, and the immediacy in which it becomes sort of just something that happens in our world is, I think, something that we should, from a lot of different perspectives, be it a Zionist perspective or the Jewish perspective, or even just a human individual perspective, the normalizing of of this situation, it frightens me in a way much more than the war itself. That being said, I don't know what's happening in the minds of the multiple leaders around the world who are running this thing. And I feel no sort of need to become a policy analyst on something that I'm not. I do, however, know that the Palestinian question has not gone anywhere, and it's in fact, quite central and quite relevant to what we're talking about. And I think it's really impossible to have a conversation about democracy in Israel without talking about the Israel-Palestine question. Um, there's obviously a lot of elements to the question of liberal democracy, which have to do with the high courts and have to do with the way church and state is run or not run. But I think the primary question always leads back to the very question of democracies, which is what is a demos and who runs who and who feels and is an equal citizen in this land and who isn't. And that's a question of politics, but for me, that's also very much a question of faith. I started off this introduction by saying that I come from an activist background, and an active background focused on questions of Jewish relationship to Palestinians. But the Jewish element of that question, even though I grew up as not only as a deeply traditional and Orthodox individual, but also one where that's very much part of my day to day. It's how I raised my children and very much part of my upbringing. There was always a sort of disconnect between my politics and my faith, for lack of a better word. I imagine I would say in private, of course, my faith informs my values and informs my ethics, and that informs my politics. But the question was set separate, and maybe even there was a fear in my mind of connecting the issues between Israel and between Israel and Judaism. And I say that as a religious individual who very much believed and still believes in separation of church and state in this country, if not only for the protection of democracy, also for the protection of religion. I think what's happened to me and other activists over the last couple of years is that we've realized that the attempt to sort of disconnect the Jewish question and the Israeli question is futile. One could say because of the way Israel is constructed today in terms of its self-understanding, and one could argue that it was always constructed that way. I'm not a historian in my work, so that's less crucial for me in the context of this conversation. What is crucial for me in this context of the conversation is that I think we need, in order to talk about the future of democracy in Israel, we need to talk about the Jewish question. When I say the Jewish question, I'm referring to what does it mean to be a sovereign and a Jew? What does it mean to be a Jew and a citizen? What is our relationship to the land of Israel? And I think those questions cannot be sort of divorced from each other. I would construct the discourse as follows. I think when this country was built, if we were to have a conversation in sort of democratic or progressive or social democratic circles, there was an attempt to reconstruct the very nature of what it means to be a Jew. Over the last probably 30 years, when we have conversations on what it means to be a Jew in Israel, you'll hear a phrase which is actually a phrase that was constructed by liberal Jews and not by Israeli liberal Jews, and not necessarily by the right, that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. And when we say Israel is a Jewish democratic state, I've heard it often argued in the past couple of years that that is the concept of Israel since its founding. What I find interesting is that the concept of Israel being a Jewish democratic state is a concept which only arises in Israel in the 80s, and one which arises formerly in Israel in the late 80s and early 90s. I think that phrase needs to be unpacked, as it's a phrase which commonly comes from, I'm going to say in the context of this conversation, our circles. I don't know you guys. I don't know exactly what you believe in, but my sense is that if I'm speaking here with you, then I'm going to say our circles, meaning circles which are liberal or minded. So you'll hear this phrase that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. I have questions about that articulation, at least how it's framed today, for a bunch of reasons which I want to share with you. I'll pose it as a question, and then I'll start maybe posing a response, and then we'll end that part of the conversation, and then you can ask me or comment or ask me about something else. I will say first that the people who talk about Jewish and democratic usually pose those as competing. There is, on one hand, a democratic nature of states in general, and there's another hand, there's a Jewish nature that belongs to, that is in contradiction with it. Sometimes on the fringes, it won't be necessarily a contradiction, but rather one is a stamp, we'll call it a communal stamp. The latter is a communal stamp of approval of the former. So for example, one will say that all citizens in a democracy should be treated equally. That comes from the democratic. And then they'll add, because man was created in the image of God, right? That's the Jewish. And then we have this sort of stamp of a communal stamp of approval on the democratic nature. Usually, however, they're posed as contradiction to each other, including in our communities. They're posed in contradiction to each other that will say, well, usually democracies need to have certain standards, A, B, C. For example, all citizens need to be treated equally, but in our circumstance, because we're Jewish, we're allowed to not do that because of X, Y, Z. What happens in that framing is that Jewish always turns into something that democracy doesn't allow. I find that problematic in many regards, primarily in Jewish regards. First, I want to point out that it never works the opposite, meaning Judaism in the context of Jewish and democratic never forbids what democracy allows. One could imagine a scenario where that's the case. One could imagine a scenario where we say, well, let's say Gaza or even the West Bank is under a closure and a type of as some on the left would call it, open air prison. That's allowed by some variations of international law, but Jewish law doesn't allow for that to happen. One could imagine an articulation like that. But the articulation that has been created, again, by liberal circles and not by the right, is that Judaism usually allows what democracy doesn't allow. Another example, which we would sometimes hear, is we believe in separation of church and state, but in a Jewish society, it doesn't necessarily need to be separated so long as that there's pluralism. So democracy demands certain things. Judaism allows you to diverge from democratic standards and norms in a lesser way. Jewry becomes the exception of democracy, and in a way which forbids allows what we would otherwise forbid. The second thing, I think, for me, that's incredibly problematic as somebody who cares deeply about democracy and cares deeply, of course, about Judaism, and that Jewry basically becomes a sin against democracy, in its primary interpretation. The second thing that I find incredibly challenging about the notion of Jewish and democratic in that regard is that Judaism basically is on the same level of democracy in terms of its orientation. And it's basically like freedom of the marketplace in terms of who defines what Judaism is. I think part of the reason that the religious right has grown so strong over the last 20 years is because all of Israel allowed it to grow strong. A lot of times people will say that, the settler right sort of took over Israel. I don't think communities take over the country while they don't notice. We need to analyze and think about why the settler right became so strong. And I think part of the reason that they became so strong is because they became the kosher certificate of what it means to be a Jewish Israeli. And part of the reason they're able to do that is because they take their Jewry very, very seriously. I could be opposed to pretty much everything they suggest, but I think they take their Judaism very, very seriously. And what's happened is that democratic Israel has conceded Judaism and Jewish Israel to the religious right. So this version of Jewish and this version of Jewish and democratic becomes basically an allowance for the settler right to basically become the identity marker of what it means to be a Jew in Israel. You find this in you find this in a lot of areas, definitely over the last couple of years. You'll find a lot of people who will say, well, I believe in territorial compromise, or I believe that we shouldn't control them. But you have to understand the Jewish relationship to the Holy Land is one where only Jews have a right to the land, and so on and so forth. Now, I've posed this primarily as a question or as a challenge. I think it's a challenge for people who care about Jewish tradition and the Jewish faith more than anybody else. I think the question then becomes, what is our response? Democratic liberal Israel, as a whole, I think is going through a identity friction on this question. One camp, and I don't know how large, I'm talking about on the intellectual level, I don't know who's sort of stronger and who's weaker. One camp says we need to secularize as much as possible. The camp of pro-democracy needs to also be the secular camp. It's a constant sort of refrain. You'll read it constantly in social media, but also newspapers like Haaretz. Another side would say we need to re-engage with the Jewish tradition in a way which allows us to articulate a democratic framework in one which makes sense to us. From my perspective, and from the faithful left perspective, the question of Jews living in Israel has always been a theological question and will continue to be a theological question. When I say a theological question, it means that even if one believes that this country needs to be a land, even if one Jew believes that this country needs to be a land for all citizens, we need to not have any control of the territories. Even if one takes a radical sort of left Zionist position or non-Zionist or left Zionist position of state for all of its citizens and so on and so forth, the question of what does it mean to be a Jew living in Israel has a theological element. It has a theological element in the story that we tell ourselves about exile and return. It has a theological element in the sense that the land of Israel, the city of Jerusalem, holds incredible significance in the Jewish tradition, in Jewish liturgy, and in Jewish halacha for the last 2,000 years. It plays a very central role in our understanding of holiness, and we need to deal with that question. So if I started off by saying that in the past, I was very reluctant, I think there's no way around the religious question or the Jewish question or the theological question today. And that's, I think, under that sort of structure is how, or under that thought is how the faithful left was founded. The term faithful or emuni in Israel is a bit of a funny word. When I say faithful left to Americans, they often tell me that that's not a good word because faithful in English usually sounds Christian. And I always respond that everything in English sounds Christian to me. But the word emuni in Israel was very conscious in the understanding that we are, while we come from, I say largely from a rabbinic tradition or Orthodox, or we say in Israel Masorti, it's much easier. Let's say sort of a rabbinic tradition. We're not we don't necessarily belong to one sector. So there are people who come from Orthodoxy or modern Orthodoxy, or what would be called in Israel Tzionut Datit, or religious Zionism. In the faithful left, there are people who come from Haredi communities. In the faithful left, there are people who come from conservative frameworks or reform frameworks. In the Small Emuni, there are people who come from traditional frameworks. In the Small Emuni, there are increasingly people who come from secular backgrounds, who come from the Small Emuni. What I think connects everybody is that our values stem pretty upfront from our faith, in the sense that my anger or critique of the occupation is also a Jewish critique. My critique of ethnic supremacy is also a Jewish critique. Conversely, or the other side of that coin is also my care and deep love for this place stems also from my Jewry. I feel deeply connected to this place, not only because of its history, but also because of its religious significance. In that sense, I think there is something which is quite small c conservative, but also maybe different than sort of the religious liberals of the past, in that we're not trying to necessarily separate our religious convictions from our political convictions. The second word, which might be problematic in faithful left, is the word left. And I want to explain that as well. First of all, it was really important for us when we started to call ourselves left, because everybody told us not to. Everybody said, people don't like that word anymore. We shouldn't say that. It distances people. Why don't we just, maybe we should use the word moderates. Maybe we shouldn't sort of be too upfront about that. I think that sort of our generation, and here I'll say I'm also one of the much older members of the faithful left. The faithful left is emerging to be a very young organization. Most of the folks are in their 20s and 30s. But I think there's a tiredness of hiding who you are. And I think that the right in Israel is very proud of being upfront about where they are. I think there's an honesty in that position and a matter of factness and a respect of even of your political opponent in that you say who you are. More importantly, I think many, um, you know, many Israelis, definitely in the religious communities, there was more of a religious left 30 or 40 years ago. And the reason that I think one of the reasons is that there isn't, or there hasn't been till recently, for a great many years, is because just people, if you don't say who you are long enough, people won't know that that's an option. But it's not only an issue of framing and of branding. And with this, I'll end at least this part of the conversation, if that's okay, because I'm looking at the time. It's also an issue of values. We come from a left tradition. Left tradition means, from our perspective, that we care primarily about questions of equality and inequality. Our perspective um, is not necessarily focused on individual freedoms and liberties, but rather on the deep care of the poor. In that sense, it's very much a left tradition, but it's also very much an Israeli left tradition, and it's also very much a Jewish left tradition. And from my perspective as a religious individual, I think that's very much also part of our more traditional past. The extreme focus on the poor and on our not only responsibility, but our full being of caring about those who have less than us, I think is a central tenet, not only of some left traditions, but also of the Jewish tradition that I was raised on. That very much has to do with Jewish poverty in the Holy Land, but it also has to do with Palestinian poverty in the Holy Land. The word poverty, I think, sometimes slims it when we talk about poverty in the English language. It mainly is a financial question. In Hebrew, you have this word dal, which means, I think, without means. And dalut, or those who are without, I think should be the central question of a democratic perspective, but also of a Jewish ethical perspective. And when we, for example, are in the territories doing protective work with Palestinians, we're primarily focused on the fact that we're trying to work with and trying to help those in this land who have less than us and who are, because of that, less are subject to tremendous forces of violence and inequality which are thrust against them. From my perspective, that's what the small Emuni is about. I think it's impossible to talk today about democracy in this country without talking about the question of what it means to be without the protections of the state. And that immediately leads to the question of Jewish power and also the question of Jewish responsibility. I want to end by saying two things. The first is I talked very, I don't know, vaguely, but I talked very theoretically. But I do feel that I need to say something about what the Small Emuni is organizationally. So I'll say that in good religious fashion, Small Emuni is not an organization, but it's already at this point 5 organizations, meaning we understood very quickly that there are different projects have different ends and different means and different ways of working. So there's no NGO called the Small Emuni, but it's rather an umbrella organization for a bunch of different projects. One, and I was telling sort of in the preparation for this call, one is called Bnei Avraham. It's an activist group. It's one of the larger activist group today working in the territories and what's called protective presence, as I'm sure you know, as people who care about this issue and are watched the news, there's been an incredible upsurge in settler violence since the 7th of October, and increasingly over the last year, and also increasingly over the last couple of weeks. Anytime there's war, there's increased settler violence. We have folks who basically put themselves near in those situations of violence to try to de-escalate the violence, whether protecting shepherds or protecting people on their way to the land, Palestinians on the way to the land. Gilad Kariv, as a member of Knesset, who we like very much, just came with us this morning to see some of our work and meet Palestinians who are being assaulted. But that's one of our projects. Conversely, we have a project called Hasadeh, which is working on formal education and building educational institutions. So we have a gap year program for Israelis starting next year. We are writing curriculum for religious school systems. At the end of the day, I send my children to religious education. We can't ignore the fact that many Israelis send their kids to religious education systems that need to be answered. We also have a book publishing house called Makom. We put out 4 books so far, and we have a Jewish journal coming out with Van Leer. First issue is supposed to come out in May. We have a program called the Midrasha, which is basically a activist training program for young adults. So there's a whole bunch of things happening, and what connects all of them, as I said, is this faithful left framework. The last thing that I wanted to say to turn into back into the theological is it's important for me to say that people like me, we're not going anywhere. I know there's so much doom and gloom about where Israel is headed, but not only do I see great hope in this place, I also see great beauty in this place. Even when being very conscious of sort of the noise around me in terms of sirens, I wouldn't live in any other. I mean, I wouldn't live in any other city, not only any other country. But I find that this is a very worthwhile place to fight for, and a tremendous responsibility, both as an Israeli and as a Jew. And I think the challenge needs to be with vis-a-vis the Palestinian question. I don't like the language of peace as compromise. The right doesn't want to compromise, but we are willing to compromise. Because what happens in the language of compromise is that when terrible things happen, as they're bound to, as they have in the last couple of years, 7th of October, not only, you revert to the position of not compromising, and that position ends up being a position of Jewish exclusivity. Rather, I would argue the question is a theological question of how do we view sharing of this land with the Palestinians as one which is a desire and an aspiration and not of compromise. And I think that framework and that framing allows us to articulate a more responsible way forward, even in times like today, which are arguably very, or not unarguably, very dim. So thank you very much for allowing me to, talk a bunch. I see 2 things in the Q&A, but there might be, I don't know how these are conducted, but I'll be happy to answer them. Rabbi Aryeh Kasherman is very courageous indeed. We love Rabbi Aryeh Kasherman. But yes, and I'll answer the first one first, Barbara. But David, how do you want to do this part of the conversation?
No, if you want to answer the questions you see, that's fine. And
Sure.
then I'll turn to my colleagues on the screen and myself, and I'll keep a watch on new questions that are coming in.
So if I understand the question about Muslims and Christians and their connection to their land is there are a lot of different responses that the Muslims that I work with, some of them are deeply religious and some of them are incredibly atheistic, give as to why they have connection to the land. Some of it has to do with question of Dar al-Islam, and some of it has to do with the fact that they're indigenous to this place, and some of this has to do with the fact that, matter of fact, this is where I live. I have just an incredible respect for that position because that's my position to the land as well, meaning my position to the land is a mixture of, um, you know, being excited about the fact that I live in Jerusalem and that people have prayed to Jerusalem for the last 2,000 years, and also that I like the food down the street. And I think that that mixture of secular and religious is what connects. Ultimately, we all like the part part of this conversation is all very obvious in the sense that there are around 7.5 million Jews who live in this territory and around 10 million Palestinians who live in this territory, and nobody's going anywhere. So then the question is, how do we view the other side not as a problem that we need to solve, but rather as the definition of this place, that there are two nations living in this place. There is and I'll say something about supremacy in that context as well. But there is uh, one of the founders of the National Library and the Hebrew University, and one of the primary translators of Greek philosophy into Hebrew in the 40s and 50s was a thinker named Shmuel Hugo Bergman, who was also a very traditional Jew, lived in Rehavia down around a kilometer away from my house. And he was a very spiritual individual, very much connected to Eastern religions as well. And he has a beautiful line, which I find myself quoting a lot, which is Chesed asa Hashem imamo shenatan et moladato l'shnei amim, which is that God graced us, His people, that He gave this land to two peoples. And I think that notion that this is ours, so it doesn't belong to them, is a notion which theologically needs to be confronted as well. I think exclusivity leads to supremacy. So the minute I say this is kulo sheli, as you say in a Talmudic saying, this is all mine, that leads you to saying that that it's my right, that it's not theirs. And when I say supremacy, I mean the fact that very clearly, in the most economic understanding of the word, my life here is worth more than lives of Palestinians here. And that refers to every type of Palestinian living on this land, be they Arab citizens or in mandatory Israel, or Arab residents in East Jerusalem, or Arab residents, or Arab peoples living in the West Bank or Gaza. And I don't want my life to be worth less than others, but I sure don't want my life to be worth more than others. I'm not secular and also atheistic Jews. They're allies and partners, and I don't think you must come to the conclusion of peace and equality through a religious lens. I very much take you from atheist thinkers, and everybody has a different language to talk about things. But we do need to recognize that an incredibly large majority of Israelis are traditional to some extent, including secular Israelis, and increasingly so since the 7th of October. So when we talk about secular Jews, most of them think that there's a Jewish connection to this land. And that means something theologically, and we need to give content to that articulation, and not only say, well, we're just responsible for the democratic part. We're not responsible for the Jewish part. So I hope that answered your question, Barbara.
Norm, please.
Yes, I hope I understood you correctly in the beginning about some clash between being Jewish and being democratic. I understand in the case of the violence on the West Bank, that's clearly obvious. That's not. But what other aspects of Jewish life that clashes with democracy or challenges? I'm not sure what the right word is, but I didn't quite follow that argument. So maybe you can give me some specific examples on a daily basis or otherwise.
Sure. Well, it's much easier to do it now than it was in the past, because there's a law called the nation state law, which allows Jewish which dictates a level of Jewish ownership versus citizen ownership, which presents a clash in law. So even before that, we can give a plethora of examples of why there were within law or without or just normatively differences and hierarchies between Jews and non-Jews in this country. But definitely in the last couple of years, there is very much within law a hierarchy between Jews and non-Jews. And that's not only in the West Bank and Gaza, that's also in Israel. And the question is, what is our response to that? Yeah, I have a friend who's an Arab Israeli, and I think we need to challenge ourselves as Democrats on that issue. And I'm saying that as somebody, I'm a Zionist. I'm not, this isn't, I live here. I'm very happy to be a Zionist in this country. I'm not, but in that context, a former president of this country, Ruby Rivlin, once gave this famous speech about the four tribes in this country. He said there are four tribes. And we need to talk about the relationship between the four tribes. He said, there's a secular tribe, and there's a religious tribe, and there's the ultra-Orthodox tribe, and the Arab tribe. And an Arab friend of mine who's a citizen of this country, he said, there aren't really four tribes in this country. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, there'll be four tribes in this country where we can imagine a president from each one of those tribes. But if we can only imagine a president from two of those four tribes, so the question is not only the disconnect between communities, but the question is structural hierarchy. So for me, the question of my desire to be in this country as a sovereign stems from the fact that I think it's my legitimate right, historically, politically. That there was a bit of noise in the back, but it's just thunder. It stems from the fact that culturally, I live a very Zionist experience, and I love my children in Hebrew, which is a product of this place, and it's very much part of my identity. And also that this place provides for me a lot of meaning. But I'm very, very much aware of the fact that there's a hierarchy between Jews and Arabs, also within the country, and increasingly so in terms of political delegitimization and so on, which I think needs to be argued against. The primary question in this country about whether we win or we don't win has also to do with the Arab vote and also has to do with the Arab coalition. And the fact that even the liberal camp in this country finds it incredibly difficult to partner with Arabs, I think is a problem of democracy, and one which we should be working for in order to fix. The relationship to theology is when we say Jewish state, what does Jewish mean? And if Jewish means that this belongs to me a bit more than it does to you, that creates an incredible amount of problems. And I think there's enough other meanings of Jewish, which isn't that, but requires us to think differently about and meet differently Arabs where they are. In this war, that's also, by the way, very, very relevant. The largest demographies in this country who don't have bomb shelters are Arabs. We need to ask ourselves about this question. What does that mean in terms of Jewish sovereignty, that the way we constructed our sovereignty is that Arabs are protected less than Jews? I think that's a fundamental problem, both on theological and on democratic grounds. And again, I'm saying that as somebody who lives here and wants to live here. So I hope that answers your question, at least in terms of what I meant. Thanks.
Good, thank you. Mark.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Rabbi. I want to go back to the settlements in the West Bank and talk to you about that a bit. Can I assume at the moment that Faithful Left and yourself support a two-state solution?
Yeah, I don't like the word solution, but because things that word freaks me out. But I would say it's just so fantastical. It's almost fantastical of talking about a faithful left. But I would say that I've written quite a bit on the importance of two states, and from an activist perspective, I think no other sort of option has been on the table. But I'm aware that people in the faithful left also support sort of like confederations and land for all, and we don't have a stance, and nor do I think anybody asks of our stance.
Well, okay, let me make another assumption. Let's assume for the moment that two-state result might be the ultimate or the most ideal result. What's your view or the view of Faithful Left in regards to what would happen under such a scenario with the settlements outside the settlement blocks and the Israelis who are living in those settlements. What do you have a thought about what would happen or what should happen?
My view is that I think Palestinian sovereignty would need to decide what to do with those settlements, and my assumption is that because settlements are strategically drawn in order to not allow continuity of Palestinian statehood, then a large majority of them would need to be evacuated. It is important for me to say that from a moral perspective, from an international perspective, there is no difference between a settlement block and a lone settlement, meaning maybe in the future settlement blocks would be legitimate, but they're just as illegitimate today as from a perspective of what it does to a future Palestinian independence. There is no difference between the settlement block of Gush Etzion and the illegal outpost, 7 kilometers to the south of that. And the reason that that's important for me to say is because in times of peace processes, it makes sense for me that we differentiate between settlement blocks and non-settlement blocks, both for pragmatic concerns and also just in terms of the way moving forward. But we're not currently in a position where there's a peace process on the table, nor remotely near it. And I think it's very dangerous to assume that settlement blocks are de facto Israel, because that basically, first of all, it makes our ability to judge right from wrong impossible. Other than the question of Israeli settlement development as might, meaning what if I was a settler, and a lot of the people in the faithful left have passed as settlers because that's our community. If I was a settler hearing settlement blocks are legitimate, I would just go try to build as many settlements as possible. Because the understanding is that, well, as long as there are enough of them, that basically even the pragmatists would concede. So my argument would be that I can only allow myself to be a two-stater if 100% of the settlements are legitimate equally.
Okay, so the only reason
when peace is on the table, we can start talking about compromises.
Right.
But
So
as it's not on the table, 67 is a moral. Yeah, continue.
So the only reason I raised the term settlement blocks is because from my understanding is that in a lot of the discussion and writings that have been put forward, that if the three settlement blocks were to be retained as part of Israel, there'd be a land swap so that territory would be given to the Palestinian state in exchange for those. That's the only reason I raised it.
Okay.
The other, and just one more, if I may, Gershom Thornburg wrote, I think, really the seminal history of the establishment of these settlements back post 1967, post the Six-Day War, an historical analysis of the first 10 years following the end of the Six-Day War. And when you look at that history, one thing that strikes out immediately is that this whole problem began with a Labor government, and then continued with successive Labor and then Likud governments, and so we know the history. So it seems to me that most of the political community, as it were, is in some ways responsible for the problem that we're now having. Is that something that would be an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I mean, it's not. Yeah, I think that's a historical accuracy. Look, I mean, there's a question of history which doesn't start at 67. I think the right is very. That's the challenges that the right pose to what's called in Israel the Zionist left, and I think it's called in the U.S. liberal Zionists or whatever. The challenges that they pose on coherency are fair, and they relate to Labor government post 67, and I would argue also today regarding the Jordan Valley. But also before 67, there's only been 1 year in the history of the state since 48 that that all Palestinians in the region were there was nobody under Israeli military rule. So a lot of times we forget that from 48 till 66, before Israel took over the territories, then Arab citizens in Israel were under military rule, and that was also a labor phenomenon. And also a lot of 48 and different transition in the beginning of 50s and late 40s is also a labor phenomenon. But I'm not. First of all, I have enough problems in my own community that I need to take the responsibility for like labor in the 1960s. It's just not the political community that I come from. And I also think that sort of like the question is, where do we go forward and not how do we look back? So looking back is important to recognize where the problems began and how do we deal with them. And I don't. But I'm not. As I said before, I'm not a historian. And if if the Labour Party positions changed, then what's important for me is that change. Now, politics are incremental. I have the politicians that I like more and the politicians that I like less. But we're hopefully in an election year and in election months, and obviously, I think anybody who cares about democracy wants a different government than this government, and that includes people who, in their past and sometimes in their present, are not don't live up to all the standards of a lefty activist such as myself. But I know I mentioned Gilad Karif purposely. The fact that there's a Labor MK who went today to the churches to deal with this issue, for me means a lot. And the fact that he's not the only one in the Labor Party, I think that's really, really important, or Democratic Party, or whatever it's called now.
The Democrats.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that and specifically to support this party or another, but I'm saying that just in terms of sort of the optimism of incrementalism. I don't think, but what you said now is which I think sort of connects to my larger point, was that this isn't something that happened in the middle of the night that good old liberals didn't notice, but rather a relationship which developed, and in order to fix that sort of relationship, I think it's Dafka that, like, the Israeli liberals and left, who need to take ownership for the story of this place and not just say, oh, we'll let the right tell the story of this place, because that leads to Hebron being the most important place for this for Israeli sovereignty. And yeah, so I think we're in agreement, basically, Mark, if I understand correctly.
Thank you.
Mikhail, a few times you mentioned your connections with Palestinians. I'm assuming that some would be from the territories and others are Israeli citizens. And you've also mentioned time and again the importance of the land. And one of the connections, I assume, in your dialogues with your Palestinian colleagues is that you both have deep connections to the land. So I'm wondering where you see this kind of conversation going, when both within the Israeli Jewish community and the Palestinian communities, both in Israel and outside, they have such different views about there's not a single cohesive position among either community. So if your interlocutors on the Palestinian side are also looking for peace and stability and security and a respect for faith within a democratic environment, can you give us some insight in terms of those conversations and where you think there are opportunities? I ask this because among many things that I know are occurring within the liberal or progressive or reform movements in North America, whatever labels and sub-labels are used, we in Canada in the reform movement have been involved in trying to develop a new curriculum for young kids. And it's called Sharing Spaces. And the idea is to develop a conversation from when they're in kindergarten all the way through schooling about addressing the fact that there are spaces that need to be shared. There are intellectual spaces, there are physical, material spaces, and there are boundaries. And that's what makes it so challenging. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what your
Sure.
communities are doing in this.
Sure. So, I mean, there's multiple sort of ways to approach this question. First, I will say that, on a personal and an emotional and communal and historical level, I find it really interesting that across the board, when we work in an area where Palestinians are there, and we talk about the ancient Jewish history of the place, that creates a sense of connection and not a sense of alienation. So that goes to Israel. If I have friends who live in, Akko or in Lod or in Jaffa, and there's definitely in terms of Akko and Lod, there's a tremendous amount of history, Jewish history. And when I talk about my connection, not from a place of this is why this is mine, but rather of this is why I love this place, I find that creates and generates a conversation, a local conversation, which I very much get excited about. And I'm trying not to be too, obviously, just like this is a minority position right now in Israel, it's a minority position among Palestinians, and it is our fight to fight. And I'm not saying that's the majority position and so on, but I know that's the position of my allies and partners. The second, on a more theoretical and theological level, is that there's a lot of different ways to approach holiness. And even in this land, we have a bunch of different models. So the model, at least historically, of Temple Mount has always been a model of ownership. Every religion claims it for its own. But we have other models where we know that various religions prayed at the same place. So historically, for example, in Meron near Tzfat, both Jews and Muslims prayed in the same place. Also now, one of the places which is perhaps much more violent, very, very violent, but didn't used to be in the past, is what's called Joseph's Tomb in Nablus, where we have historical record of Jews and Muslims coming to pray together because they both recognize the historical significance of it. So the reason I mentioned that is because there's a lot of different ways to approach holiness, whether we approach it through exclusivity or through mutual relationship and connection. And I think a lot of that has to do with how do we come to an area, and that doesn't necessarily mean dissolving boundaries, but rather talking about them respectfully. So, for example, a lot of our protective presence work is in Palestinian areas, and because I keep kosher and our activists keep kosher, so it raises a lot of questions because, in general, halachically, at least orthodoxly, you can't eat food cooked by non-Jews, and it becomes very problem. Even if the food's kosher, you're not allowed to eat food cooked by non-Jews, and that obviously provides a lot of challenges. And what I've found is that the way to handle that is to have honest conversation as partners who are with this together about what that means and what the reasons is. And then what you'll find is that the Palestinians the Palestinians that we work with also don't want to be borderless with us, borderless in the communal sense. They're interested in creating separations. But they're also aware that we're putting ourselves at risk to protect them physically. So it creates a whole different context in which we have conversation about mutual respect and care. A lot of the journal that we're going to be putting out in May, and a lot of it will be in English as well, is going to be particularly on that issue about what does place mean and what does holiness mean. Not necessarily written for kids, but I think it can create sort of a backdrop in which it's possible to talk about those things in a different way. And I think that's part of our responsibility as people who care about this stuff.
And just one more question from me right now. What are your conversations like with others in the Orthodox community? As I understand it, there are certainly there are divisions within the Orthodox, and then you get to the Haredim. And are you able to transcend those borders or boundaries?
you know, uh, we're talking about millions of people. So obviously it's less linear, and I would say this. I'm very conscious of the fact that we represent a minority position among religious Zionists or Haredi backgrounds. I'm not um, naive or overly romantic, but we all choose to be very much within those communities to the extent that we can, um, which means that it creates a relationship which is complicated, like all real relationship between people and institutions. So, you know, the teachers of my kids maybe vote for Ben-Gvir, but they also really love my children and think about constantly how to make their lives and days better. And I have a tremendous amount of respect and love for that position. And I say this as somebody who cares deeply about politics and is sort of committing my life to it. Not everything is about politics. Sometimes it's just about relationships, and it's
Yeah.
about caring for other people. And opinions are opinions. You can and they can change. A lot of people who are in the faithful left had different opinions in the past, and some of the people that have different opinions from me now will have different opinions in the future. And I hope that I'll have different opinions, or my opinions will develop 20 years from now. I'll be incredibly bored with myself if not. I think what's important for us is to create sort of a serious and engaged space that we create, and hope that's appealing enough to bring more people on board, and to take them seriously and to treat them lovingly and listen to their concerns, critically and seriously. But I don't see our role as in convincing. I see our role as sort of creating our spaces in a hopefully modest way, and hope again that it's engaging enough as an alternative that people will join. And so far that's been the case. But I think that's always the primary challenge, is to just sort of create the home that you want in a more serious way, and not sort of constantly think, wait a minute, what does he think about this, or what does she think about this, or how do we do this opposition research, or how do we do this attack? Or I've been in those positions in our organizations, and I know that they're
Yeah.
important in politics. This is probably not for me.
Right. Less.
Less for me. Less Rothschild. And I'm going to
Yeah.
need to go soon, so we're going to,
Yes.
if
Okay.
that's okay.
We'll wind it up
Yeah.
in a minute.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, David. What you just said maybe answers a bit of my question. Let me fix this here.
It's okay. I feel like you're high-fiving me. It's fine.
Um, you talked about, taking a way forward, and I think what you just talked about was a lot of theoretical, right? But what is the way forward? Like what allows you to say, okay, here's the next step? For example, right? You said, the blocks would, in your mind, need to not be part of Israel, right? In a settlement. Now, I'm not sure if that's your negotiating stance.
Yeah.
It sounds to your negotiating stance, but I don't think that would be a popular view in Israel.
Yeah.
So practically, where are you going? What's happening? After the next election or during the next election? What can you do to make a difference apart from what you just said? Talking to and communicating with various people and having them understand your ideas, but how does that move it forward?
Sure. I mean, there's always a long term and there's always a short term answer. And the long term, I think, for us is more significant in that it's about institution building, and that means education. The first thing we set up when we started taking ourselves seriously organizationally is we set up an organization that does education. The right's been very good on that in the last 30 years. I grew up in more moderate education than my kids do, because the radical right, build strong institutions which train rabbis and train teachers, and those are the people who end up teaching. And we need to sort of, in that sense, it's It's classic institution building, which I think all Jews know about all over the world, but that's what needs to be done. Every generation in Israel had its religious left, and those are our models, and are very important for me personally. And some of their books are on in the bookshelf behind. But as opposed to the right, nobody built institutions. Nobody said, what does a school look like? What does a rabbi's training look like? How do we make sure that we have city rabbis? How do we make sure that we grow in that regard? How do we create curriculum for teachers, and so on and so forth? I know that's a long-term answer, and we'll talk about the short-term answer soon. But I think that is what stands, I think, always at the center of our project, is thinking institutionally and organizationally, and that has to do with theory and action. But that's most of my day to day, when I'm very excited and happy to have these conversations. But most of it is about organizing teachers, organized training, building these projects. I mentioned we have a gap year next year. It used to be, until next year, that if you're a religious lefty, you don't have any program. Next year, there'll be a program for 10. Hopefully, in 3 years, there'll be a program for 50. And in 6 years, there'll be a program for 100. I think that's the way we're looking at this. I'm not a politician at all, but there are very much politicians who I feel closely aligned to our cause. I mentioned one of them, but I can mention more. I mean, people like Naama Lazimi, people who also self-identify as being in the faithful left orbit, and from our perspective, they promote both our language and our causes. On the question that I care about most, which is the question of the territories, I think what's important is to create on that more directly sort of a interest in a grassroots for an alternative, because one can write posts on Facebook about how terrible things are in the territories from here till tomorrow, but if you're not there on the ground, and if you're not creating a sense that there's a balance, then nobody's going to be interested in creating an alternative. And I think part of the reason that there's been more writing in the last couple of weeks is both because the situation is more dire, but there's more knowledge of the situation because there are people who are active, and there's a categoric difference there if you have 100 activists or 500. At the end of the day, the answer less is very boring. It's just about organizing. It's but I feel it's uninteresting for me to give you an answer, definitely in the times that we live, where there's a US president who, I think about sort of like my kids and what they've gone through in the last decade of like a worldwide disease, and sort of like a breakdown of all international norms. And for me to come and talk about the third settlement block and whether that's pragmatic or unpragmatic seems to me very unpragmatic. But what I want is moral-minded people in the room when those negotiations happen. And for that, we need to raise and build politicians and political actors and create constituencies for them. And that has all the way to do from education to activism to organizing to mobilizing. And there, I think, that's it's the very dull and very beautiful world of politics, I think, is my answer to you. But I think it's unserious to sort of draw out a map of a two-state solution when we are where we are now.
But isn't the problem now as well that yes, there's more interest and more activity on the left in terms of what's happening in the territories now, but that's true on the right as well, right?
Yeah.
Right. That I mean, the situation is bubbling up on both sides, and
and to be fair, they're much stronger than we are, and it also has to do with the fact there's a lot of phenomena which is huge in this country. There's the right's done a very good job in sort of positioning itself in the military in high positions, but we've done very good job in police. We can. But again, I'm not an analyst, and I'm not. I don't write reports in the media. I'm just another activist, and the question that we should be asking us is, if they're there, why aren't we there? Like that's, I think, the question that we should be constantly asking ourselves. So if I can write, that's why I like opposition research. I think it's important, but. Okay, we get it. The right's done a great job in the last 30 years. It's not another article convincing me about how the right funding did this or how the right organization did that, if I don't have any response, it's just incredibly depressing. But if we already know that the right's been very conscious on that, so why is it impossible for us to imagine that we can't do things which are similar? And there it just gets back to saying, like, just have faith in the process and say, in the right where we grew up, there's a song, right? The forever people aren't afraid of the long road. That makes for incredibly powerful politics. You build. Let's talk in 30 years. I think that's sort of what we're trying to do. Let's hope it's successful as we can make it.
Okay.
Mikhael, I'm conscious of the fact that you have to go, and thank you for giving us more of your time than I think you had planned for. This has been really very interesting. I think you've opened up a lot of new knowledge and insight into worlds that many of us online aren't very well aware of, and are deeply concerned about. Some of us for a long time have been able to give, I think, reasonably strong arguments against the expansion into the occupied territories and proto-annexation and efforts to deal with this from a security and international relations and law perspective. And yet we've seen those things undermined or overwhelmed by the power of the religious right and the religious nationalists, Zionists, who claim the land and this vision, which disturbs many of us. So it's good to hear your voice and your explanation, and I think you've opened up some new avenues of thinking and discussion for all of us. So with that, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. And it's been a pleasure and an honor. And thank you so much for the interesting conversation and the good questions. And
Thank
hope to be
you.
in contact with
Yeah.
some of you soon.
Yes, and please
Bye.
do send. We'll make materials available. Thank you.
Will do. Good
Thank
night.
you. Night.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Just want to
And for everyone who's still on, to remind you that next week we have a session on Israel and the Horn of Africa, really through this emerging new diplomatic and security relationship between Israel and Somaliland, and issues of both opportunity and problems. And Max Webb, who's an independent analyst, will be with us then. Les?
no, I have nothing else. Thank you very much,
Great.
David, and the panelists.
Thank you, David. It was very good. Thank you.
And it certainly brought a little, different perspective. And I'm glad that we did this. And thank you everybody for coming. And we'll see you next week.
Okay.